He threw her out, never knowing she was pregnant with triplets. 3 years later, he saw 3 little girls who looked exactly like him. Samuel Harper's penthouse overlooked the city skyline like a throne room. It was late evening, the floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting a glowing skyline outside, while tension thickened inside the walls. Ashley stood near the door, barely holding herself together, her soft features pale and lips trembling. She had come to talk, to explain, but Samuel was already halfway through a tirade she hadn't expected. His brown eyes, once warm and teasing, were now cold and hard, shadowed by suspicion and bruised pride. His light tan suit, flawless and expensive, only made the distance between them feel wider, colder. Ashley clutched her bag in both hands, feeling the swell beneath her coat, a secret she hadn't been ready to share until tonight. Her heart beat loudly in her chest as Samuel's words pierced through the room like steel. "Get out of my house," he barked again, his voice louder this time, each syllable laced with finality. "Now!" Ashley didn't move. She opened her mouth, hesitated, and tried to gather the words she had practiced so many times. But they vanished under the weight of his glare. He thought she was using him, manipulating him, clinging out of convenience. He had built walls after years of being betrayed, and tonight he believed she was just one more lie. She wanted to tell him about the doctor's visit, about the 3 tiny heartbeats on the screen, about how terrified and thrilled she had been. But in the face of his anger, the words froze in her throat. He turned away before she could speak. To him, the conversation was over. Whatever they had shared in late-night conversations, on spontaneous trips or slow mornings over coffee, had been erased by the suspicion now poisoning his judgment. Ashley blinked back, the sting in her eyes. She could have yelled, she could have begged. But instead, she looked at him one last time, memorizing the shape of the man who had once made her feel like the center of his universe. Then she quietly stepped outside, the door clicking shut behind her like a seal over the life she had just lost. The elevator ride felt endless. Her fingers gripped the railing as if her body might collapse. By the time she reached the lobby, she already knew she wouldn't go back. She had no plan, only a growing certainty that this wasn't just heartbreak, this was a crossroad, and she would walk it alone. What Samuel didn't know, what he never even gave her the chance to say, was that she was pregnant with his daughters. 3 of them, identical. She had learned just 2 days ago and hadn't stopped thinking about how to tell him since. But now, that future had shattered. Ashley stepped into the street, the night air crisp and biting. Her world had changed entirely, and he didn't even know. She whispered to the tiny lives inside her, "It's okay, I've got you," even as fear crept into every corner of her mind. And somewhere above her, in that penthouse full of silence and pride, Samuel poured himself a drink and sat in the dark, unaware that with 5 reckless words he had just walked away from the only family he would ever create. Ashley left the city the very next day. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, not even her closest friend, and she didn't take much, just 2 suitcases, the last of her savings, and the quiet resolve of someone who had no choice but to start over. She bought a one-way train ticket to a small coastal town nearly 5 hours away, a place she had once visited with her mother as a child. There was no plan beyond that, no job lined up, no apartment waiting. But the idea of staying in the city, of seeing Samuel's name on billboards and business magazines while carrying a piece of him inside her, was unbearable. The train rocked gently as it moved further away from the life she had known, the world she thought she'd be building with him. She held her coat closed over her stomach and stared out the window, not crying, just silent, because she had already cried too much. The town she arrived in was small, sleepy, and surrounded by pine forests and gray ocean cliffs. The kind of place where strangers nodded when they passed and where secrets could stay buried if you needed them to. Ashley found a temporary room in a modest guest house run by a widow who asked no questions and made warm soup. Over the next few weeks, she walked everywhere looking for work, trying to keep the panic from swallowing her whole. Eventually, she found a part-time job at a small bakery. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough to cover rent at a 1-bedroom cottage just outside town, with chipped paint on the windowsills and creaky floorboards that reminded her she was safe. The pregnancy progressed quickly. Her body changed in ways she hadn't expected, not just because she was carrying triplets, but because of the loneliness that settled in her bones like winter frost. She attended every doctor's appointment alone, learning terms she'd never heard before, watching 3 little hearts flicker on a screen while gripping the edges of the exam table to steady herself. Complications were mentioned early, high risk, close monitoring, strict bed rest later on, but Ashley smiled and nodded, willing herself to be brave because there was no other option. She worked until her back ached and her fingers swelled, saving every extra dollar for the babies. Some nights, she lay in bed and whispered names out loud, testing how they sounded in the dark: Ellie, Emma, Avery, her little trio, her miracle. She avoided mirrors, not because she didn't like how she looked, but because sometimes the sight of her own reflection reminded her too much of the life she had almost had. Samuel's face would flash in her memory at odd moments, in the shape of her cheekbones, in the eyes staring back at her, in the names of business headlines she tried not to read when waiting in line at the market. He hadn't reached out, he probably hadn't even tried. That part of it hurt more than anything else. Not the fight, not the cruel dismissal, but the silence afterward, the confirmation that she had mattered so little. But the girls kept growing, and so did her strength. When the contractions started early, at just over 32 weeks, she was terrified. The ambulance ride felt endless, the hospital too bright, but the doctors were fast, the nurses kind. After a tense delivery, all 3 girls were born screaming, alive and healthy enough to breathe on their own. She cried then, finally allowing herself to collapse into something vulnerable. She was a mother, alone, yes, exhausted beyond reason, but they were hers and they were here. The first weeks were a blur, feedings every 2 hours, constant diaper changes, 3 tiny voices learning to cry in harmony. The nights were long and full of doubt, but Ashley never broke. She turned her living room into a nursery, lined with second-hand cribs and baskets of baby clothes. Friends from the bakery brought casseroles and left them at her doorstep. The neighbor mowed her lawn without asking. Even in a small town, kindness found her. By the time the girls turned 1, they had become the center of her world. They were loud and wild and curious, each with her own little spark of personality. Ellie was the leader, always the first to explore. Emma was soft and observant, often watching before acting. Avery was a storm of energy, always moving, always climbing. They had their father's hair and his eyes, the same intense brown with gold flecks that had once captivated Ashley in the worst and best of ways. She didn't speak of him, not to anyone. But some nights, when the girls were asleep and the cottage was still, she would whisper his name softly into the silence, unsure whether it was a memory, a hope, or a wound. And still, through every challenge, every sleepless night and scraped knee, Ashley remained unwavering. She had built a life from nothing, created joy from what should have broken her. Samuel Harper didn't know that 3 versions of himself were learning to run, to laugh, to live without him. But someday she knew the world had a strange way of making truth impossible to avoid, and when that day came, she didn't know what she would say, only that she would be ready. By the time the girls turned 3, Ashley had settled into a rhythm that somehow balanced exhaustion and contentment in equal measure. Her days were filled with small but meaningful routines: packing snack bags, wiping tiny faces, folding endless little socks, calming tantrums that erupted over the wrong color cup, or missing stuffed animals. Life in the small coastal town remained quiet, but inside the cottage it was anything but. The girls brought a whirlwind of energy and emotion into every corner of the house, transforming even silence into something alive. Their laughter echoed off the walls in the mornings, and their synchronized cries filled the air on difficult nights, but through it all, Ashley found a strange kind of peace. She knew now that peace didn't mean stillness, it meant presence. Ellie, Emma, and Avery were growing into themselves, each more distinct by the day. Ellie had a commanding spirit that reminded Ashley of a lion cub, fearless and often ahead of her sisters. Emma was more inward, the one who would stop to examine a flower or ask questions about the moon. Avery was the wild card, boisterous, unpredictable, often covered in dirt or glitter depending on the moment. Together, they were a perfect storm. They had a bond so deep and instinctual it didn't need words, often communicating in glances or half sentences. When one was upset, the others noticed. When one laughed, the rest soon followed, and in all three, Ashley could see glimpses of Samuel. Sometimes, it was the arch of their eyebrows when they were determined, or the way their eyes narrowed when they were focused. And every time she saw it, she had to remind herself to breathe through the ache it brought. She didn't speak his name, not in front of the girls, not even in her own mind when she could avoid it. As far as they were concerned, they had no father, just their mother, their home, their backyard full of wildflowers, and a world that felt big and magical through the lens of childhood. But as the girls grew, the questions became more frequent and harder to avoid. At first it was simple: why do some of the kids at the park have daddies? Where is ours? Ashley answered with soft honesty, explaining that not all families looked the same, that their story was theirs alone, and that it was full of love, even if it didn't look like others. But inside, she knew the time would come when she would have to say more, when they would need the truth, or when the truth might find them on its own. What Ashley didn't know was that Samuel had started feeling the cracks in the life he thought was perfect. His business continued to grow, his name continued to appear in headlines, but inside, something had shifted. It began subtly in emptiness during business trips, the quiet annoyance at champagne toasts that once made him feel powerful, the strange discomfort he felt walking into his penthouse and realizing how utterly lifeless it had become. He dated casually, but none of the connections lasted. None of the women laughed the way Ashley had. None of them looked at him like he was more than the empire he built. The echo of her silence never left him. It had haunted him for 3 years, growing louder the more he tried to ignore it. He still didn't know she had been pregnant. He had told himself for so long that her leaving was selfish, manipulative, even cruel. But if that had been true, wouldn't she have reached out? Wouldn't she have demanded something: money, attention, revenge? Instead, she had vanished, as if his presence in her life had been a wound too deep to revisit. That thought began to gnaw at him. What if he'd been wrong? What if his rage had blinded him to something real? One night, as Ashley sat on the porch watching the girls play with sticks in the yard, building some imaginary fortress, she felt a strange sense of time folding in on itself. 3 years ago she had been alone, afraid, unsure if she could survive what lay ahead. Now, her world was far from perfect, but it was hers. She had earned every ounce of its joy. And though a part of her still ached, still carried the scar of abandonment, she no longer felt powerless. If Samuel Harper ever came back into their lives, she would face him not as the broken woman he left behind, but as the mother of 3 daughters who had never once needed him to know their worth. She didn't know it yet, but that moment was closer than she thought. The town's annual spring charity gala was an event Ashley never planned to attend. It was too fancy, too crowded, and reminded her too much of a world she had left behind. But this year, a friend from the bakery, now on the organizing committee, had gently insisted she come. Just for a bit, she'd said. Bring the girls. It's a family event now. Games, music, food stalls. You'll blend in. Ashley wasn't convinced, but the twins had overheard the conversation, and the idea of dressing up for something outside their normal world had sparked an excitement she couldn't ignore. They wore pale-colored dresses and matching bows. Ashley pulled on a light blue gown she hadn't worn in years. It still fit, though it felt like it belonged to someone else. As she looked at her reflection, softer now, wiser, more grounded, she felt a strange calm. She wasn't sure why, but something in her sensed this night might shift something. The event was held at the town's only upscale restaurant, a glass-fronted building overlooking the sea. Fairy lights lined the walkway, music drifted from a small string quartet in the corner, and families gathered on the outdoor terrace under a soft orange sunset. Ashley arrived with her daughters in tow, their small hands clutching hers as they took in the spectacle. The girls, dressed in simple but lovely light suits she'd found second-hand, looked like magic in motion, curious, smiling, unmistakably identical. They charmed everyone they passed. No one would have guessed they were the daughters of one of the country's most powerful CEOs. At the same event, in a world that rarely overlapped with Ashley's anymore, Samuel Harper had arrived with a delegation from his foundation. His presence was requested for the publicity, the cameras, the press, the influence. He wore a light beige suit that accentuated his features, his dark brown hair swept back neatly, his expression unreadable as always. He shook hands, smiled politely, made short speeches, but he was distant, going through the motions, disconnected even in the middle of a room built for celebration. His assistant handed him a glass of champagne just as he turned to scan the crowd, not searching for anything, simply observing. And then he saw her. She was standing near the dessert table, half turned toward the girls, who were laughing about something on their paper plates. Ashley's blonde hair was swept back loosely, and the soft dress she wore fluttered around her in the sea breeze. She hadn't seen him yet. But he saw her, and then he saw them. 3 little girls. 3, not 1, not 2, but 3. They looked like mirrors of each other and of him. His breath caught so hard in his chest that he had to set his glass down. He stared without meaning to, heart pounding every logical part of his brain, trying to reject what his eyes already knew. He stepped forward before thinking, before planning, before understanding what he was doing. It was instinct, a gravitational pull. He walked toward her across the stone terrace, weaving through the clusters of guests, not blinking, not breathing. Ashley turned then. She knew the moment her eyes landed on him. Her body froze first, then her expression shifted, shock, disbelief, then something colder, more guarded. She didn't move. The girls continued laughing beside her, unaware. When Samuel stopped in front of her, he couldn't find words at first. She looked exactly the same, and yet completely changed. More woman than girl, more mother than anything he remembered. And behind her, 3 small girls with his hair and his eyes played quietly, the truth screaming at him without a single word spoken. He finally asked, quietly, like his voice was breaking, "Are they mine?" Ashley didn't answer right away. Her jaw tightened slightly. She turned to look at the girls, who were now eyeing the stranger curiously. Then she turned back to him, and with a calm that came from years of holding it all in, she said, "Yes, yours, all 3. He staggered back slightly, as if the words had hit him like a physical blow. She didn't explain further. She didn't cry or lash out. Her voice held no anger, only exhaustion. She had already lived through the hardest parts without him. One of the girls, Ellie, walked up to Samuel with her head tilted. She studied him silently for a moment, then said, "You look like us." Samuel couldn't breathe. Ashley reached for her hand gently. "Come on, sweetheart, let's go get some air." But Samuel stepped forward, his voice low and pleading. "Wait, please. I didn't know." "Ashley, if I'd known." She turned, eyes sharp now. "But you didn't care enough to ask." And with that she walked past him, her daughters following close behind. He didn't chase her. Not then. Not yet. But nothing would ever be the same again. Samuel didn't sleep the night after the charity gala. He returned to his penthouse in the city, but everything felt wrong. The silence that had once been comforting now screamed. The polished floors, the curated furniture, the enormous windows with perfect views, all of it felt lifeless, meaningless. He stood in the middle of his living room for hours, still wearing the same suit, unable to sit down or move on. The image of Ashley standing there, radiant and distant, with 3 daughters that looked so painfully like him, replayed in his mind again and again. The disbelief had worn off quickly. What replaced it was shame, the kind that sat heavy in his chest and didn't leave. He had thrown her out of his life, had never tried to find her, had built 100 justifications in his mind to avoid asking the question that mattered most: what if he had been wrong? The next morning he called off every meeting and flew back to the town. He didn't know what he planned to say, or even if she would see him, but the thought of going another day without knowing his daughters, without facing what he had done, was unbearable. He rented a car at the airport and drove through the quiet streets of the coastal town until he found the bakery he'd seen her walk past the night before. He parked, waited outside, and when she finally appeared with a paper bag and coffee in her hand, she stopped cold. Her expression said everything she had not expected him to follow her, and she certainly wasn't happy about it. "I'm not here to make a scene," he said, his voice low. "Just, can we talk?" Ashley didn't respond for a moment. She looked down at the coffee in her hand like it might give her strength, then finally said, "You have 5 minutes." They sat on a bench nearby, tucked between 2 hedges, where the street noise was faint. Samuel didn't launch into an apology. He didn't offer excuses. Instead, he said the words she never expected him to say, I was wrong. He told her he had thought she was manipulating him, that he let fear and pride speak louder than his heart. He admitted he had been too proud to look back and too arrogant to imagine she might have walked away for reasons bigger than a fight. And then he asked the question that haunted him most, "Why didn't you tell me?" Ashley looked at him for a long time. Her voice was calm when she finally answered, but it carried the weight of 3 years behind it. "You told me to leave, Sam. You didn't just close the door, you slammed it. I was scared, pregnant, and alone. And I knew even if I came back to tell you, you wouldn't have listened. You were already done with me before I even had the chance." She didn't say it to hurt him. It was just the truth. He lowered his eyes, ashamed. "I should have tried to find you." She nodded. "Yes, you should have." They sat in silence for a few more minutes. Then Samuel asked about the girls, their names, what they liked. If they had favorite colors, or bedtime routines. He asked softly, cautiously, like every detail was a gift he wasn't sure he deserved. And Ashley answered, not because she owed him, but because the girls deserved a father who wanted to know them. As she spoke, something in her voice softened. He noticed but didn't dare mistake it for forgiveness, not yet. Before they parted, he asked the question that had been clawing at him since last night. "Can I meet them? I don't mean today, I mean, when you're ready, on your terms." Ashley didn't say yes. But she didn't say no either. Instead, she simply said, "We'll see." He took that as a start. That evening, when Ashley told the girls someone had asked about them, they had a dozen questions. What's his name? Is he nice? Does he like cookies? She didn't mention who he was, not yet. But when Ellie said, "He sounds like someone who wants to be our friend," Ashley couldn't stop the tear that slipped down her cheek. Because, for the first time in years, she wasn't completely alone in raising them. The man she had once loved, who had pushed her away so carelessly, had finally shown up, not to claim, not to control, but to understand. And that changed everything. Samuel began visiting the town quietly, without drawing attention. He rented a small apartment near the edge of the neighborhood and kept his presence low-key, as if afraid a single misstep would make Ashley vanish again. He didn't try to rush things. He didn't demand to see the girls or ask Ashley for second chances. Instead, he showed up in small, consistent ways, bringing books to donate to the local preschool, offering to help repair a broken swing in the park, occasionally buying too many muffins from the bakery and pretending it was an accident. At first, Ashley remained distant, polite but guarded, watching everything he did with cautious eyes. But she noticed the difference immediately. He wasn't the same man who once barked orders from across penthouse rooms. There was something slower in him now, more careful, as if he understood how easily trust could break and how hard it was to rebuild. The girls first met him by accident. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Ashley was walking them home from the park when they spotted Samuel kneeling beside a bush, trying to coax a stray cat with a tin of tuna. Avery, fearless as ever, ran up to him and asked if the cat had a name. Samuel looked up, startled, and when he saw all 3 girls staring at him with the same wide brown eyes, he could barely answer. Ashley watched the moment from a short distance, her breath catching as she saw how naturally they clustered around him. He spoke gently, crouched at their level, asking their names even though he already knew. They giggled when he mispronounced Avery's on purpose, and Emma, usually the shy one, slipped her hand into his without realizing. After a few minutes, Ashley called them back, ready to end the encounter, but the girls protested. "Can we see the Catman again?" Ellie asked later, and Ashley simply nodded, unsure how to explain the ache in her chest. From then on, the girls saw more of him: short visits in the park, spontaneous games of tag, help with art projects during library story hour. Samuel never pushed. He never referred to himself as their father, or tried to replace anyone. Instead, he asked questions about their interests, let them tell him long, winding stories about imaginary creatures, and memorized every detail they offered. He made them feel important, seen. Ashley watched from the sidelines, her skepticism softening with each passing week. One day she found the girls drawing pictures at the kitchen table. 3 versions of the same scene, them holding hands with a tall man in a suit with dark brown hair. They had labeled him "Our Friend Sam." That night, after the girls were asleep, Ashley found herself walking toward his apartment. She hadn't planned it, hadn't rehearsed what to say, but when he opened the door, she saw he wasn't surprised. He stepped aside and let her in. The space was simple, barely furnished, but clean. It was a far cry from the opulence he used to wrap himself in. They sat across from each other at the tiny table by the window, and for a long time, neither spoke. Finally Ashley said, "They like you. I see it. And I don't want to keep pretending you don't exist in their lives, but this doesn't erase the past." Samuel nodded. "I don't expect it to. I just want to be part of the present, and if I'm lucky, maybe the future." She studied him, trying to find the old patterns: arrogance, defensiveness, control. But they were gone. What remained was something she hadn't seen before: humility, regret. A man trying to become better not for show, but because he had learned what it cost to fail the people who mattered most. He didn't ask to stay the night. He didn't move closer or take her hand. He simply said, "Thank you for letting me near them. That's more than I deserve." Ashley left soon after, her mind tangled in thoughts. But something had shifted. Not in grand gestures or sudden forgiveness, but in the quiet understanding that healing was already happening, one moment at a time. The next day she gave him a small notebook filled with notes about the girls, favorite foods, allergies, routines, fears, and bedtime songs. It was a guide, a bridge between the life she had built and the one he hoped to join. And when he took it in his hands, something in both of them finally relaxed. It was no longer about what had been lost. It was about what might still be saved. Summer crept into the town with long golden evenings and soft ocean breezes that made the trees whisper and the sidewalks shimmer under the fading light. For Ashley it marked 3 years since her world had split in two. But unlike the past summers which she had spent surviving, this one felt different. There was a new rhythm to her days, a subtle shift in the air. The girls laughed louder now, their joy deeper, more grounded. They had begun to include Samuel in their daily lives, without needing Ashley to orchestrate it. They called him Sam with casual affection, not quite knowing yet what his full place was in their story, but sensing intuitively that he belonged somewhere close. Ashley watched from a quiet corner of her heart. She noticed how Samuel had memorized which girl needed an extra blanket when she napped, who hated peanut butter, and who always wanted to sit in the middle during movie nights. He didn't miss the little things. He didn't pretend to know more than he did. And most important of all, he never once acted like any of it was owed to him. Every gesture, every moment of connection, he treated like something precious and borrowed, knowing full well that trust, once broken, took more than promises to restore. One night, after the girls had fallen asleep during a backyard campout and Ashley was folding blankets under the porch light, Samuel appeared at the gate. He carried a simple envelope in his hand, not sealed. When he handed it to her, he didn't say anything, only that she should read it when she was ready. He didn't linger, he just nodded, turned and walked back down the path with his usual quiet presence. Ashley stood there for a long time, the letter resting in her palm like it held something heavier than paper. Inside, the letter was written in his handwriting, careful and steady. He had clearly rewritten it several times, some lines crossed out, some rewritten in the margins. It wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. "Ashley, I know no words can undo what I said to you the night I lost you. I've played it over 1,000 times, and in every version, I wish I had listened instead of reacted. I was afraid. Not of you, but of what you made me feel: vulnerable, real, seen. I pushed you away because I didn't know how to trust anything that wasn't built on logic and control. I see now how blind I was. You gave me something I didn't deserve: a chance to be a father, and you did it without asking for anything in return. I don't know if I'll ever be worthy of that, but I want to be the kind of man who tries every single day. Not for you, not even for forgiveness, but for them, for Ellie, Emma, and Avery, for the family I could have lost forever. If one day you find it in your heart to let me be more than Sam, I'll be here, no conditions, no expectations, just hope." Ashley read it twice, then a third time. The emotion that rose in her wasn't rage or sorrow, but a quiet wave of something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because everything had been acknowledged: the damage, the regret, the growth. She had waited so long for him to understand, and now that he finally did, she wasn't sure what came next. She didn't respond right away. She let the letter sit on her nightstand for days, sometimes rereading it in the early morning when the girls were still asleep. During those days, she paid close attention to the way Samuel knelt beside Avery to tie her shoes, to the way he crouched during their tea parties and listened to long, nonsensical stories, as if they were sacred, to the way he always asked before he stepped in, always gave her space to say no. But she didn't. One Friday evening, Ashley invited him for dinner. No reason, no excuse, just them, in the home she had built without him. She watched him take off his jacket and help set the table, watched the girls drag him into their evening routine like he had always been there. And as they sat down to eat spaghetti with too much Parmesan and juice in mismatched cups, Ashley caught his eye and gave him a quiet smile, not wide, not dramatic, just steady. And in that moment something shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, but it was the beginning of something new, something earned, something he had waited years to hold and dared not ask for. It was the first time in 3 years that Samuel Harper didn't feel like an outsider in his own story. Autumn settled into the town with golden leaves and cooler air, and with it came the girl's 4th birthday. Ashley had been planning something small, just a picnic at the local park with a few friends and neighbors, something simple and joyful like all their other birthdays. But this year, the girls had grown older and more aware, and they had their own ideas. They wanted balloons, games, decorations, cupcakes with 3 colors of frosting, and most of all they wanted Sam to be there. They asked in unison, as they often did when something mattered, and Ashley had only smiled and said yes, though her heart fluttered a little faster with each passing day. She hadn't called him to ask for help, she didn't need to. Samuel appeared 3 days before the party with a quiet knock on the door and a car full of decorations, handmade invitations he'd printed himself, and matching dresses he'd found for the girls that they would later insist on wearing every weekend afterward. He didn't ask if she needed anything. He simply acted like someone who understood the importance of showing up not just once, but always. Ashley didn't push him away this time. She let him string paper lanterns around the backyard and hang streamers from the trees. She let him take the lead on organizing silly party games. She even let him pick up the cake, trusting for the first time in years that he wouldn't disappear. The day of the party arrived with bright skies and cool breeze. Guests trickled in from the bakery and the library, from the preschool and the corner market. There was laughter and music, the kind that lingers long after the sound fades. The girls were glowing in their matching dresses, their curls bouncing as they ran across the grass, their giggles echoing as Samuel spun them around like he'd been doing it their whole lives. He had brought them each a small gift, nothing extravagant, just handmade storybooks with their names in them and drawings he had commissioned from a local artist based on the adventures they often told him about. They held on to them like treasure. Ashley watched it all from under the shade of an old oak tree, her heart swelling and aching at once. It wasn't just the sight of Samuel with the girls, or how naturally they loved him, or even how he seemed to anticipate their every move. It was the way he looked at her from across the yard, not with longing or apology but with something more powerful respect. There was no pressure in his eyes, only hope, the quiet kind that waits without demand. She hadn't told him yet how much had changed inside her. She hadn't found the right moment. But the truth was, she had already forgiven him in the only way that mattered, by allowing him to be part of the life they had built, not as a visitor, but as someone who belonged. As the sun dipped lower and the last of the guests began to leave, the girl sat curled up in a blanket with Samuel, listening to him read one of the stories he had written. Their heads rested on his shoulders, their fingers playing with the buttons of his shirt, their eyes heavy with the kind of sleep that only comes after a perfect day. Ashley stepped closer and sat beside him, their arms almost touching. He looked at her and smiled, tired but full, and she smiled back without hesitation. "I've been thinking," she said softly, almost more to herself than to him, "about what the girls will remember, about what I'll remember." He nodded slowly. "I hope it's the good parts." "It is," she said, "it will be." There was a long silence between them, not heavy but comforting, like a shared breath. And then she added, "You can stay tonight, if you want." He didn't answer right away, didn't move suddenly or let emotions spill out. He only looked at her like he'd been waiting for that sentence for years and didn't want to do anything to break the moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "I do want to, but only if it's what you want too." She nodded. That night, after the girls had been carried to bed, after the kitchen had been cleaned and the leftover cake tucked into the fridge, Samuel didn't go back to his apartment. He stayed, not just in the house but in the quiet space Ashley had kept hidden from him for so long. He stayed in the living room, sitting on the couch beside her while the night crept in around them, while soft music played and candlelight flickered. They didn't talk much, they didn't need to. In the morning the girls woke to find him still there, sipping coffee with their mother as if he had always been part of the morning. And in that moment, Ashley knew something important had happened, not loud, not dramatic but real. Forgiveness had turned into something deeper, a choice, a second beginning. It hadn't come easily, it hadn't come fast, but it had come honestly through time, effort, mistakes, and the quiet rebuilding of a broken bond. They were not the same people they had been, but together they had become something stronger, something whole. A family. The ending of the story feels earned not because everything turns out perfectly, but because it honors the hard, often painful journey both characters had to take to arrive there. Forgiveness doesn't come easily, especially when trust has been shattered and years have been lost. What makes this conclusion satisfying is that it doesn't rely on grand romantic gestures or rushed redemption. Instead, it's built on small acts of consistency, humility, and emotional courage. Samuel doesn't swoop in to rescue anyone. He learns to show up, listen, and grow. Ashley doesn't forget the past. She remembers, processes, and chooses to open her heart again without losing her strength. The children aren't just background characters either. They're the bridge, the mirror, and the reason both parents evolve. It's a hopeful ending, but not an unrealistic one. That's what gives it weight. The story shocks not with scandal but with sincerity. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest plot twist isn't revenge or revelation, it's healing, and healing, when earned, is the most powerful kind of ending there is.